Hello and welcome to Learn It from a Layman. I am Carl Christensen, back with Cameron Christensen. Cameron, you want to say hi?
Hi.
And Tim, unfortunately, has weaseled his way back into the cyberspace that we tried to block him from.
Like the common
Almost
cold,
like-
you think I'm gone, and then inexplicably I return.
I said new jokes, Tim. New jokes.
Oh, sorry, I thought you said nude jokes, and I was like, no way, you dirty. We're not going to.
Just to let the audience in on why I am saying new jokes, we had we had, let's say, a bit of technical difficulties starting this podcast the first time, and that should prepare you for the quality of the material that is about to follow. Unfortunately, we were missing Matt this week, and about a month, our last episode was mostly presented by Matt and was one of our highest performing episodes. And so apparently all of you are probably right now wondering why he's not available and why you're listening to me and Cameron and Tim instead, but that is what you have to deal with. And please listen. Anyway, subject of the podcast today will be measurement of time. So this is going to be different than some of the time-related stuff that we talked about during our physics podcast. We're going to be talking more about units of measurement for time and the history of measuring time. We'll talk a little bit about time perception and time awareness and those types of things. But we're going to start off with kind of a very layman level of year numbering. So I'm going to let Cameron tell us a little bit about why we are currently in the year 2019.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. So I believe before random people took out things in our numbering system or changed what they meant, like AD and BC. So from what I understood it and grew up, BC was before Christ and AD was after the event, or some Latin word that meant that. And that's how we number. So from Christ's birth to now, it has been 2019 years. So that's why we're at 2019.
All right. Yes.
So
thank you.
That's what I'm going with.
Good. Cool. That is more or less correct. Tim, any additional comments?
Yeah, well, just
that's good enough. Thank you, Tim.
I actually said it all super fast. If you slow down this recording and listen to it at 1/10 of the speed, you'll hear an entire lecture. Yeah. I was just going to add that AD was Anno Domini, or however you say it, the year of our Lord.
Right.
And so,
correct.
Anyways.
Yep. But now they have changed the meanings of those to something else, which I don't know, and quite frankly, have never really cared to learn.
CE, which stands for Common Era, if I remember right. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So and that's relatively recent, I believe, the addition of the CE addition to those abbreviations, to those terms, but originally, right, this numbering system, the year numbering system was introduced by the Romans, and that is at least that's my understanding. So essentially, obviously, given the history of Western Europe and the prevalence of Christianity in that area, that was the calendar system the year counting system revolved around how they figured when the birth of Christ was. So yeah, before Christ, Anno Domini or Domini, in the year of our Lord, and that didn't actually start being counted officially, at least in the Roman Empire, until what I'm reading here is in the year 525 AD is when it was actually formalized. Before that, the Romans were using a different system of counting years that was counted from the foundation of the Rome. and so that was the way that they were counting years before that. And so obviously pre-Western civilization, globalization of the world, different cultures, different societies had different ways of counting years, and so obviously Egypt, Mesoamerica, Mesopotamia, China, Middle East, all had their own ways of measuring years and counting them. And so it's only been in the last, 500 years or so that these things have become more standardized. And because the Western world was the first to kind of, to some degree, colonize, and some imperial type of takeover, we kind of standardized from the top down. There is some bottom up adoption as well, but that's the way that it became ubiquitous across the globe to use the Roman year system. Tim, I cut you off, which I like to do, but I was going to go back and just ask if you had anything else to
say. Not much. Cameron commented on the kind of feeling a little bit of consternation at the change from BC and AD to the BCE and CE system, and I share some of his feelings. I do understand how in kind of the globalized world where the majority of the people who are using this numbering system don't trace back a tradition in Christianity, as once was the case when it was just the Western world using this system. So, I mean, I get why they would kind of change the acronym, but at the same time, it feels a bit contrived to me because we're still, measuring from the same spot. It's not like using different, letters changes the fact that we're still measuring time from the estimation of the birth date of Christ. And so it just seems to me a little like, really, it's just contrived. But
I mean, if it stands for common era, I mean, you would have to be like, first off, you would have to define an era, which is what, like 1,000 years, right? Something like that.
Yeah, I don't know what they mean by common era.
So
common in what way?
Technically, our BCE should be constantly moving up. Or if it's common era, only relevant era would be within the last 100 years, which would be common to everybody.
Yeah, we could have
reset. I feel that you have a problem.
Yeah, they're obviously trying to keep it's an issue that lots of engineers run across. You're trying to maintain support for an older system while kind of adapting it to a new playing field. And so, yeah, I mean, it kind of like Tim said, they're trying to adapt it to people that don't associate it with a particular event or any event that they have any significance with. Yeah, I mean, it is what it is. So,
and I'll say I feel like there's kind of two things going on. One is kind of globalizing it and generalizing it. They're making it generic so that anyone can use it, which doesn't bother me so much. I do feel like it is part of a modern trend to kind of wash faith and religion out of the public sphere in general. And that does kind of annoy me a little bit. I feel like our society has a tendency to be real touchy about religion and to just kind of erase it from the public sector. And so anything that's shared among people, we have to kind of, erase or at least sweep under the rug references to or religion, which it's so deeply ingrained in anything. I mean, you look at some of the most common words in our language, and they have these religious roots. Just people don't realize it, and it just it all seems a little like papering things over to me and kind of plugging our ears. So.
Sure, and as we'll see as we talk more about time measurements here, there are lots of the ways that we measure time are all have histories in cultures that we might not have agreed with in the past. We generally don't care, but for whatever reason, current sensitivities are what they are. And the numbering system, if you want to refer to it as BC or BCE, then I don't personally care. But yeah, we'll move on from that topic for now. But the one interesting thing before we move on, though, is the Chinese calendar, where most year numbering systems historically counted up, right? They, in the case of obviously Christ's birth, we're talking before that we're counting down, in retro as we look back, we're counting down and then back up. But in the case of the Chinese system, the years are not they're not in a sequence. Not an infinite sequence, at least. They go in 60-year repeats, and so they go every 60 years. They start it back over, and so that is how the Chinese did their calendar before, obviously standardizing to some extent. Obviously, they still celebrate the Chinese New Year and all those types of things, but that's mostly just culturally in actual business and in international. Conversations. They still obviously respect the what has become the global calendar now. So, just thought that was interesting. Okay, now we're going to move to months. All right. Well, actually, before we move to months, we have to talk a little bit about. So, the idea of a year is pretty clear cut as far as we're talking about one one orbit of the Earth around the sun, right? And that's been pretty clear to civilization for thousands and thousands of years. Now how they were going to split that up between seasons and all those types of things, that's kind of what we're going to dive into now. But the idea of a year being one revolution, or one, the seasons changing from winter to spring to summer to fall and back to winter, that was pretty clear to everyone as to what, that's a year. But how to split that up into different meaningful segments is interesting history as well, especially given how important the calendar is in our society now, and there are so many archaic things that we don't even think about. And so we're going to talk a little bit about our months here now in the month of December or December. You'd imagine that would be the 10th month.
10th month?
Yeah, you would, wouldn't you? You'd be wrong.
Because October, 8 being Oct.
Of course, and that is also the 8th month, right? No.
And it all goes back to in the Roman Empire, or actually in the Middle Ages, where a monk was carrying all the months of the year to print on a calendar, and had them on note cards, and he tripped and shuffled them. They got all scrambled. He put them back together. He was in a rush. Went in, they put them into print and distributed all the copies. And ever since then.
No, Tim. That's what we call fake news.
But it sells so well.
Tim, do you also work for the Onion Network?
Hey, we should do. Maybe we shouldn't. We'll try to keep things pretty factual here. Okay, so in reality, do either of you know, because I certainly didn't before researching this, where and which months existed when back when December actually meant 10th month? What was? Do either of you know the history behind that?
Not really. I do remember that it was Rome that actually came up with a lot of the months and organized it. Yeah. Hence the reason we have several Roman emperors' names in months. So.
And that's right. July and August are the new additions, and they're the ones who bumped everything up 2 months. So being inserted before October, the 2 extra months pushed October up to the 10th, and November to the 11th, and December to the 12th.
That's what most people believe, and it is untrue.
Fake news, Carl. It sells.
Yeah. So originally, the calendar of King Romulus was
Isn't that from Star Trek?
Not that Romulus. Not a Romulan.
Wrong.
No, it had 10 months. And it started in March. That was the first month.
That's why in the Army to this day, when they want you to start, they say March.
Nope. That's also wow. This is why people don't listen to us.
I'm like Matt's like I'm the yang to his yin.
But we need Matt in order to contrast you.
Yeah, there's no one here to tell the truth, and well, you're doing a good job, I think. So carry on. I need something else to contradict.
Right. And so essentially, they started it in March. They started the calendar in March, and it went through to December. And it was, I don't remember how many days were in that calendar, but it didn't actually cover the full year. And the general idea was that the days that were not inside of that calendar just didn't matter because they weren't part of the actual harvesting year. And so whatever, let's not even count them. And so it wasn't until later when I remember get the name here. Another one of the Roman emperors, I believe it was Julius, the Julian calendar, correct, came in and said he had spent some time in Egypt and had noticed that they had a 365-day year, and it seemed to make a lot of sense. And so he went through the the bureaucracy of trying to get the calendar changed, which is pretty easy when you're in charge.
And that's why to this day that popular song goes, "Calendar like an Egyptian."
I don't think that's my word. Okay.
Sorry, okay. I'm pushing too hard, aren't I?
Hopefully people are coming back for the comedic effect now more than the factual input here. But yeah, so it's been 2,000 years essentially that at least the Western civilization has had a 12-month calendar, and so
wait, you didn't finish the story. He comes back and he's
he got the Julian calendar. He went through, sat down, and figured out with his advisors or whatever that they needed a calendar that actually had that more or less had 365 days. And so they added those 2 extra months before March. January and February were the additions. And that is when December, the 10th month, and September, October, November, December, all of a sudden those lost their meaning.
So it's January and February that bumped them forward.
Yep, that's correct.
Really?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, what about July and August then?
So those did used to have different names.
So they just renamed them.
Correct. And so they renamed what was Quintilis and Sextilis, which were the 5th and the 6th months, but had already become the 7th and 8th months to July and August, obviously honoring their themselves. But but they had already become displaced in the calendar by the time that they were renamed.
So what? Oh, so that renaming didn't happen at the same time?
No, it did not.
But did it happen within a few years? Was it during the time of Julius or Augustus?
I don't know exactly the time frame for when those were added. I'd have to spend exact. Let's just say I don't know, because that's a good layman answer. I don't know when those were changed.
Let's leave it to our many viewers to you discover it and leave in the comments.
Right.
And tell us how stupid we are.
Yeah. That's perfect. So and as many months did back in those days, they were kind of lunar influenced. They're months that were somewhere between. They weren't fully lunar months, but they had there's a term for it, and I can't find it right now, but they were influenced by the lunar cycles, and so the months either had 29 or 31 days. And that was because they believed that odd numbers were unlucky or something along those lines, which is also explains what. So once they were trying to formalize all this, they figured out and get it to a 365-day calendar. They figured out that one of these months had to have an even number of days, and so they said, well, let's mess over February. It's a relative newcomer. And why they went to 28, I don't remember exactly, instead of going to 30, but that's the way it shook out. And so that's kind of some of the facts about how the current calendar came together. But it is interesting that, like I said, the Egyptians had this idea of a 365-day year down before, as did, I believe, to some degree, the Mayans. And so the Western civilization is taking some of these good ideas and putting them together, but it by no means the genesis of some of these ideas. So that's kind of the bird's eye view of where the names come for the years. So we had the Julian calendar, sorry, for the months, not the years. The Julian calendar, and then, oh, hold on, I just got your name. Later in 8 BC. There we go, 8 BC. Quintilius was named Julius in 44 BC to honor Julius because it was a month of his birth. And
So
that was 2 years after. Hold
Oh.
on. At the time Julius took office, the season's calendars were 3 months out of alignment. So Julius added 2 extra months in the year 46 BC. So it was only 2 years later that the 5th month was renamed to July, which is obviously by then the 7th month, but only 2 years later. And then it was not until 8 BC, so about 40 years later, or 35, that they then changed August to or Sextilis to Augustus, or August to honor of Caesar Augustus,
which would have been during Augustus's reign, and
right,
and right at that's kind of funny, right at the what would eventually become, year zero of our modern reckoning of years.
Right.
Huh.
Yep. And so that calendar, the Julian calendar, kind of stayed that way for quite a while until the Gregorian calendar took over. So Pope Gregory the Eighth came up with. So they had leap years. Everything was pretty good, but it wasn't perfect. And so the Gregorian calendar came in and essentially fixed it.
Is that when the year was like, the winter was happening in the summer or something, and Pope Gregory had to come in and say, all right, chumps, we're going to just chop off a bunch of days and we're going to jump straight from, we're going to skip a whole bunch of weeks or something?
I think it did involve some of that. I don't have the specifics on that, but yeah, I do believe there were some changes that went down in order to get things synced up again. And okay, so around the 16th century is when this happened, and that's when we started recognizing that certain, it wasn't every 4th year that there had to be a leap year. We had to make some exceptions in order to get the decimal place in order correctly, more or less, or almost exactly at this point. So that the Gregorian calendar is what we have now, and it's very much like the Julian calendar with some additional fixes in there in order to. So yeah, right, here you go, Tim. It says the Pope had cut 10 days from the current calendar. So
only
jumped from October 4th to October 15th the next day. So
that's cool. It's not, crazy. It's not going to make a post-apocalyptic, disaster film, but
that's a good long nap, though, huh?
That's
so
right.
Did we time travel?
That's right.
Ooh, we'll have to end with a discussion of time travel, everyone's favorite topic.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so that's we won't belabor this too much longer, but I thought it was interesting. And like I said, a lot of this is some sort of misconception about which months were added, and July and August messed up the whole thing. Well, no, actually, that was not the case. They did rename months that had also been named for numbers, but those numbers were already out of place by the time they were renamed.
Though it really happened at nearly the same time, only
nearly,
2 years.
but right, but they weren't shoved in there. July, or January, and February were the ones that were added. And it is also interesting then. So it explains why January, the middle of winter, is the beginning of the year, which doesn't make a lot of sense, given that if you're thinking about thousands of years ago,
would be like spring.
Yeah, you'd imagine, that you were talking more about farmers and beginning of the year. If you think about old civilizations that were mostly agricultural based, said the beginning of the year probably would have been when they planted, and that makes sense.
Or astronomical, solstice maybe,
sure,
or
solstice,
equinox.
Right, something along those lines. But January doesn't make a lot of sense to be the beginning of the year until you understand the calendar a little bit more. So. So that is
January always seemed like a two-faced month to me. But
awesome.
Obscure Greek god pun, maybe?
Yes, I think you missed. That is certainly not a layman pun. I think you lost most people there.
It's about as good as apropos.
Apropos.
That one.
Apropos.
Is
yes.
that okay?
Apropos. Yes.
My joke was better off of that. With my potpourri joke.
Okay, good. I'm glad that the most important part of this is jokes.
Apropos. Got to practice that one. Apropos.
Apropos. Okay, we're moving on.
I feel like Scooby-Doo.
Okay, so then there's a question of days, or a week, let's say. Do either of you know where the 7-day week came from?
Well,
I think we should have an even day week. It makes more sense. We should make it 8.
Carl, when a mommy month and a daddy month.
Oh boy.
Wait, stop.
No.
Love each other very much.
That's right.
Yeah. So the 7-day week essentially originates from what I've read, Judaism, biblical origins, and so. You're talking Mesopotamian origin, Abrahamic, Mosaic, and so from the Judeo-Christian mesh. We've got a 7-day work week, and so that kind of a 7-day week that was that kind of became the standard as we standardized everything across the globe. And so that's kind of where the week comes from. And then days, once again, those are pretty clear cut. How we measure days, obviously not as clear cut. And so we'll get a little bit into that. A day obviously being a full revolution of the earth. And people obviously from the Neanderthals probably understood that. But how and why do we have 24 hours in a day as opposed to some other arbitrary number of hours, and why are there 60 minutes in an hour and 60 seconds in a minute?
Well, clearly, back when the Romans
widgets.
Yeah, I was going to say back when the Romans were setting things up, they just looked at a clock and they said, "Oh, well, look at this. It's divided up in 60 minutes to an hour." So
that's right. Chicken or the egg, real question. Does the clock come first? No.
I'm guessing it's a more recent invention than the months.
Right?
Well, divided at 24 hours.
I mean, a lot of the standardization is right, and this goes across the board. I want to get into that a little bit more in a second, but it turns out once again we have a lot of this to thank on the Egyptians, who were very ahead of their time in a lot of things.
They were run by space aliens.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, how else did they build those pyramids?
And so they kind of figured out a 24-hour clock. they had 12 hours of the day marked by sundials, and they had 12 hours during the day, and then at night they figured out a way of counting stars that came down to 12 stars that they counted during
Who
the
is
night.
this again?
The Egyptians.
Egyptians. Okay.
Yeah, so the astronomers and some that helped them figure out at night, and anyway, so and that's how they came down to a kind of a 24-hour day.
12 at night and then 12
a day during the day, exactly. Yeah. So, and then as far as the 60 minutes and 60 seconds, that is more recent, but that the Babylonians used the sexagesimal system, base 60.
Interesting.
And so
that's a weird system.
Yeah, exactly. Base 60 does sound weird, doesn't it?
Be a good name for a band.
No.
Just you wait.
And so that, along with some Greek astronomers, they started trying to standardize the distance between these stars and latitude and longitude, and that started making its way over into the counting of time. As you can imagine, that makes sense as you're talking about the way you're trying to count the distance, count time based on stars and how stars move. Then you're going to be, and if you've already been measuring the distance between stars in a sexagesimal system based on degrees, and that's where, as we start talking about minutes, that if you know how you measure distance in degrees, those can be referred to as kind of minutes or degrees as well. Anyway, so and that's kind of a very layman understanding of how we got the seconds and minutes as well. It's a sexagesimal system coming from Babylonians, plus a Greek astronomers starting to devise systems of latitude and longitude that then translated over into the time system by being able to count as stars moved. We're counting seconds and minutes. So that's those were base 60 systems, and so that's how they moved over into minutes and seconds, minutes, hours. Hours obviously already counted to 24. So,
any relation between the Babylonian system and the Chinese system, both having a base 60?
That is a good question. In the articles I read, they did not talk about the Chinese systems. Chinese probably getting a short end of the stick in this. They once again were also had their own system set up, and a lot of them made sense as well. But in the at least the articles I read were at least giving credit to either Western or Middle Eastern sources much more than Chinese. Well,
and probably the bottom line is what Cameron mentioned, that both systems got their start from the aliens who came to visit. And,
exactly.
I mean, it's the only thing that makes sense.
That's
so,
right.
But here's my proposal. I think, along with America should switch to the metric system, we should also go to a base 10 system for time.
Ooh, I'm sure that's about to happen, given that we can't even move over from feet and miles, which make no sense, to meters and kilometers and all that kind of stuff. So,
well, when I become supreme world leader, I will do that for you all.
Okay.
So that would and now that's interesting. And of course, it will never happen. And I think one of the reasons why is because even more so than our conception. So for speaking of Americans and our, death grip on, the American standardized system, I guess the British would point out that it's not the American system originally, but whatever.
It's the imperial system,
there
just
we
so
go.
you know.
So, and those are so intuitive, I know how fast 60 miles an hour is, how long 1 mile is, how far 10 feet is. I think time is even more deeply ingrained. I don't know what would happen to, how it would feel to measure something not in seconds, but in a, some, measurement that's like equivalent to a second and a half.
Right.
Not in hours, but to something that is equivalent to an hour and 15 minutes. It'd be weird.
Just call it a decade. Then it's base 10.
Decant. I guess we could keep seconds and minutes the same, and
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're going to move on from this hypothetical
100
system.
seconds make 1 minute.
Once
100
I've got it
minutes make
figured
1
out,
hour.
It does.
tell the world.
You are highlighting the fact that, yeah, like you said, these systems are arbitrary, right? They are coming. They come from us to us from antiquity through kind of chance.
Apropos.
Bless you. Okay, so
Don't swear in German.
yeah, so then there's this question of when everything became standardized, right? So these systems, like I said, there are different cultures that had them at different times, and the standardization of time is a very recent type of development. Do either of you have any idea why or what precipitated the standardization? Let's say time zones, for example.
That's a totally natural question. What
I would say
precipitated-
standardization happened because of expansion. When everybody lived close in one city, it's easy to be all in the same time. But as you go farther across the world and communication becomes stronger, you can't all be, the world's big. Part of it's in day, part of it's in night.
I will add, I think standardization became necessary because of speed. There was no need to, noon was always just when the sun was directly overhead and you weren't going anywhere fast enough for it to really be a worry, what time it was, a few hours or even a few days travel one way or the other. I think I remember hearing that it was really the advent of trains, which allowed for the first high-speed, long-distance movement that necessitated time zones because they had to be able to synchronize and
Ding, ding, ding.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
Yep.
Alrighty. So go ahead and give us the full story.
Yeah, I mean that's really what it comes down to. Is before you mentioned most everything that I'd been reading as far as before that time was all local. Like I said, people set the time based on their noon at their place, right? At where they were. If it was when the sun's overhead, that's noon. And so, but yeah, as we started globalization, in particular, the advent of the railway, all of a sudden we need to be able to track, times that way across regions, and so that started getting set up in the year. Let's see, United States railroad companies started using them.
We're talking like about 100 years.
Yeah, so 1883 was when they started being in use. In 1878, a Canadian. So thanks to Canadian that we have some Canadian listeners. So thank you for the time zones.
UDA.
Where it says Sir Sanford Fleming proposed a system where worldwide time zones that we use today. So that is, in the grand scheme of things, that's really recent that we have time zones. Obviously, effectively, we had some semblance of, people recognize that, time is different based on where you were, but the globalization and standardization of it is a relatively recent development based on, the ability we had to travel on rail. So.
What about some countries that refuse to be split into time zones, like Russia?
Right, and Russia is China. China, yeah. I mean, governments still have the final say, and so it is the case that different governments did adopt this time zone system at different rates, So it wasn't the case that there was some global authority that imposed it. It's just in order to set up a system that worked across the globe. Different governments adopted this system as it became advantageous for them to do so. So yeah, that's the history. What?
Should we get started on daylight savings? and how it's pointless.
We are not.
Indeed it is.
We are not talking about daylight savings.
Come to beautiful Arizona, where we
I will
don't
plug
engage
that
in
for.
such shenanigans.
I'll do a good plug for a good YouTube channel. CP Gray does a beautiful job explaining how stupid daylight savings is,
Huzzah. Click
and the problems that
below.
we actually run into it, because not all countries start and end daylight savings at the same time, which causes a lot of issues.
Yeah.
Not all countries actually do it. So yeah.
Okay. So that's time zones. We won't belabor that anymore either. But I wanted to hit on one more really interesting thing before we finish off this podcast, and this is time awareness. So these are all arbitrary measurements of time for the most part. Well, beyond obviously a day, revolution of the Earth, and a year, or revolution around the sun. But even that, and if what does that mean if we were on a different planet? Obviously, then we're different. Years are different, and days are different, and so time seems largely arbitrary.
So we should start going by Star Trek, Star Date.
Right. So I guess that more question, the question of how does time play out in the mind? Our perception of time is largely what matters, given that we're talking about our finite existence here. What do you guys? So let's start with the phrase "a watch pot never boils."
Why? I've seen it boil.
Why is that a saying, and what does that have? What insight can you give on perception of time?
Well, I think the perception that it's saying is when you're watching something, it takes longer for it to happen than when you're distracted. So when you're focused on something, time seems to move slowly or more slower.
Specifically with anticipation. If it's hoped for, or an event you're waiting for and looking forward to, psychologically, I
don't think you have to be looking forward to something. It could be something bad,
Well, I think if, on the contrary, if you're dreading something, then you're hoping it won't go. Then it creeps up on you, right? And all of a sudden it's here, right? Oh, I need more time to to finish my. Oh, I'm out of time, right? And how did it go so quickly?
That's just because you're a good procrastinator.
Yeah. So it turns out in the fields of science that study these types of time perception issues, there are lots of different things that affect how we perceive time pass, and they can measure them to some degree, which is really interesting. For example, there's something called the oddball effect. So essentially, the idea there is
Isn't that a Bond villain?
Odd job. It's close. So essentially, if I'll read the Wikipedia definition, and then I'll try to give it a better layman. It says perception of the duration of an event seems to be modulated by our recent experiences. Humans typically overestimate the perceived duration of the initial event in a stream of identical events.
I would say we tend to exaggerate, not overestimate.
Well, no, literally overestimate. Literally, so the first time you see something happen or something different happens, something inside of us perceives that time to be longer because we are taking in more somehow.
I wonder if it's
that when we're a child, things a year feels like forever. Versus
that's a different thing.
Adults.
That's a different thing.
I wonder if it's because our attention is more engaged. We're taking everything in, and all of that processing, it registers as time passing. And then by the time I've done it 10 times, I'm not as engaged. I'm not needing to process as much. And so it doesn't register with me as much time passing.
Yes. I guess I'm no obviously neuroscientist here, but
I
the
will claim to be, since no one can check to verify.
I'll
people
verify that
know
you're not
that's
a
not true.
neuroscientist.
Anyway, that was one of the interesting things. Here's another one, the kappa effect. The kappa effect, or perceptual time dilation, is a form of temporal illusion verifiable by experiment, wherein the temporal duration between a sequence of consecutive stimuli is thought to be relatively longer or shorter than its actual elapsed time due to the spatial, auditory, tactile separation between each consecutive stimuli. Okay, so that's a bunch of stuff that doesn't make any sense. So generally the idea there is that, okay, and it gives this example in Wikipedia as well. If you've got a trip and you split that trip up into two equal amounts of time, but the first chunk of it, you travel faster. So you go further, but you travel faster. And then the second chunk is, once again, the same amount of time, but you travel slower and go slower. You travel slower and go less far. The one that the time that you go faster, that first part of the trip where you go faster, will seem to take longer, even though it's the same amount of time as the second one.
Huh. Because more you're passing more, and therefore you think that more time is passing.
Right, exactly. The stimuli, you're seeing more things, and so it seems like more time has elapsed, even though the same amount of time will have elapsed in the next trip, but you just don't see as much. You're not taking in as much. So
interesting.
So the stimuli that we receive really affects the way that we perceive time. And that's, once again, this idea of a watch pot doesn't boil. If you're just staring at something, right, what stimuli you're receiving. Well, anyway, like I said, lots of different things. Chronostasis is another way where you, anyway, we won't dig into all of these, but what some of the other ones the Cameron already mentioned are changes with age. For example, Tim, being wicked old, it generally underestimates a given interval of time.
Yeah, like I feel like we've been talking for a good 10 minutes.
Exactly. So that is another interesting one that they can measure, right? So kids think that they overestimate an amount of time. An actual amount of time. So if you say, how long was that? And it's actually been 5 minutes, they'll say, oh, that was 10, 15 minutes. Where a mature adult or, an octogenarian, someone getting up there in years will say, oh, that was, 3 or 4 minutes.
What was that chronostasis or whatever thing you mentioned? You have to tell us what it is now.
Oh, you want me to go back to that one?
Yeah.
Okay. The perception of space and time undergoes distortions during rapid saccadic eye movements. Chronostasis is a time of temporal illusion in which the first impression following the introduction of a new event or task demand to the brain appears to be extended in time. So that's kind of related to the oddball effect, at least the way I understand it.
Yeah.
It says the most well-known version of this illusion is known as the stopped clock illusion, wherein a subject's first impression of the second-hand movement on an analog clock subsequent to the ones that directed attention. So if you're just looking at the clock, the perception is that the first second takes a long time, and after that it gets back up to speed.
Oh, huh. Okay. Wow.
So, yeah. So changes with age.
Are we going to talk about like internal clocks or anything like that?
You mean
like?
Go ahead.
I have, for me, I have a fairly good perception of time elapsed when I'm doing certain activities. Is that just because I've done those activities a long time enough that I can just know?
I believe it's, from what I've been reading, it really there's a lot of different things that go into it. As to how well we perceive time, but there is something neurologically inside of us that is there to keep time. It marks time for us, and when our system gets a jolt, something changes, be it a fear factor, or some emotional response that can throw off that ticker in our head, and that's when our perception changes. So lots of studies that have been done on this recently. It was really interesting to do some reading about this, but generally, I think that's really useful to know that the passage of time is influenced by different stimuli, and so understanding that can also help you understand, where some of these different things that you experience in your life, as far as when you're scared. Like I said, fear is one of the big ones that affects your perception of time.
Mm.
So
Empathy.
if I want time to go slower, I just need to have lots of stimulus all the time, or new stimulus all the
Or be
time.
afraid.
Or
Maybe
be
hire
afraid.
someone to like stalk you and like threaten you.
I think there was an SNL skit about that. Scared Jim, where
There
they
you
send
go.
somebody to scare you and try to beat you up to get you to be more fit.
It's cutting edge. That's right. Hey, Cameron, here's something on you talked about internal like clocks or whatever. They have done studies where they've had people stay in caves for long periods of time, and they've measured their circadian rhythms to see, how long they would sleep and how long they would eventually their kind of period of day would be. And there was some variation. A group that went and spent from 5 to 13 days, and one subject adopted a period of 30 hours, so a 30-hour day, one of 27 initially, decreasing to 24 to 25 hours. One person stayed in a cave for 127 days and eventually got into a kind of circadian rhythm of about 25 hours. So slightly longer than a
Standard day.
day. But anyways, interesting. We don't think about how our bodies are synced to sunlight and how it can throw us off when we do things like work a graveyard shift, or run lots of lights, or stare at screens late into the night, and it can kind of throw off our sleep rhythms. So,
They do a lot of graveyard shifts, so I'm well aware of that.
and I say this as I stare at a large, bright screen at 10:30 at night.
Yeah.
So,
So,
but I wonder,
go ahead.
would a group versus individual change that? If you had a group of people in the cave, would people synchronize?
Yeah. It seems like most people, their rhythm was slightly longer than 24 hours, but again, it does say that one group of four awoke roughly every 24 hours. So maybe having more people would kind of normalize that, and you get closer to like the human average.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to see.
Right, there are lots of questions, lots of research, and so we'll finish up with. They said there's lots of research going on in this area, and it says the research has important implications for our understanding of attention deficit hyperactivity, so ADHD, post-traumatic stress disorders, depression, schizophrenia. All of these things are temporal awareness type of issues, and so they can understand a bit how we process time. They think that they have a better understanding of how to treat those types of issues, because all of those have an effect on time. So they've done studies on depression and time perception, and turns out that when you're depressed, let me get this right here before I misquote it, but
I would say time is longer.
It says depression may increase one's ability to perceive time accurately. One study assessed this concept by asking subjects to estimate the time that had passed during intervals ranging from 3 seconds to 65 seconds. Results indicated that depressed subjects more accurately estimated the amount of time that had passed than non-depressed patients.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah, so there clearly some relationship there as far as
depressed people have a more acute sense of time. Huh.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
For whatever reason. So anyway, I'm really interested in that type of research into measurements of time. That's obviously our measurements, neurological measurements of time, as opposed to what we started the podcast with, which is kind of these calendar and pragmatic ways of measuring time. But that is what I had prepared for. So, Cameron, Tim, any final words?
I will
Tim, you
just
go.
I will just put this out as a personal observation that I'm curious if anyone else has experienced. I underwent a very minor operation a couple years ago, I think, where I was under anesthesia, kind of put out for I think a couple of hours, and I remember this sensation from falling asleep under the anesthesia to waking up. It was different than the sensation of falling to sleep at night or in a nap and waking up after. And it was the bizarre thing was, after falling asleep and waking up in the morning, I wake up with a sense of time having passed. But when I woke up from the anesthesia, it was just, there was no sensation of time having passed. I, might as well have just like gone under and right back up for how it felt. So I'm wondering if anyone else has felt that, if you've gone under for an operation or something, if you've experienced that kind of the bizarre chop of consciousness. Going to sleep, we say we're going out of consciousness, but it's not the same as really being fully out of it, from my experience. So I'll just leave that out there for people.
I would say I've also been under anesthesia, and I did not have that same experience.
Really?
Yes.
I wonder if it's different with different anesthetics too. Maybe different ones have different effects.
I don't know.
There was a section on sleep here. Let me touch on that as we leave, so we don't leave everyone on a cliffhanger. Perception of time is temporarily suspended during sleep, or more often during REM sleep. This can be attributed to the altered state of consciousness associated with sleep that prevents awareness of the surroundings. Waking up, a person subjectively feels no time has passed, but reasons them. So that, I guess, that first sentence there makes it sound like that time is suspended during REM sleep, and so maybe you had a lot of dreams while you were out, and Cameron didn't.
Maybe
they told me that I did not want to wake up from my anesthesia. I was actually out longer than normal.
Oh, really? Ooh.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, so some open questions. This is
anyway. My final thought was 1 minute is 0.02 if you ever have to do a time clock conversion.
Oh, good to know.
Hours. How it's a base 10. The base 60 to base 10.
0.02.
0.02 is 1 minute.
All right.
In a day?
No, like 1 minute. Like, when you're adding up much time to figure. So, like, money to time, you know what I mean?
Money to time.
Time is money.
I'm confused.
So, like a conversion, it goes into a base 10 system.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
Like, you get paid X amount per hour, which is a base 10.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
1 minute is 0.02
of an hour.
Of an hour.
That doesn't make any sense. There's 60 in it.
Out of 100. No, it's 0.02.
Is that okay? Me. All right. Well, there you go.
Yeah. Well,
okay.
1 divided by 60. So yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to end by saying that this has been very
apropos.
Apropos.
There you go. Okay. Well, and hope you sleep well tonight, everyone that's been listening. This is a very different take on time than we did our last. We ended with our last one where we were getting sucked into a black hole. So hopefully this one.
Hopefully you have no perception of time.
Exactly.
While you sleep, because you're sleeping better.
Hopefully listening to this podcast was not like watching a pot of water boil. And
when will it end?
Goodbye, everyone, and we'll see you next time.